Today is May 23rd, the year 2003. We're aboard the Battleship New Jersey in Camden, New Jersey. My name is Dr. Tom Banner from Came University. I'm part of the Battleship New Jersey Oral History Project. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Richard Hardy, who came aboard ship in August 1944 and served until August 1945. He had the rating of ensign. His duties included working as the Mark I computer operator for the 5-inch battery aft plot. Mr. Hardy, thank you for talking with us today.
You're quite welcome.
We'll start off the conversation by asking, how did you get to be involved with the ship?
Very simple. I graduated from the Naval Academy in June of 1944, and they gave me a piece of paper that said orders. You will report to the New Jersey and go to San Francisco for further transportation, which I did, and it took me about 2 months for leave, and we had some aviation exposure, I guess you would say, a little practice down in Jacksonville before we headed for the West Coast.
What made you apply and enter the Naval Academy?
I wanted to go to the Naval Academy from way back when I was about in 6th grade.
And tell us then, what were your experiences as you first came aboard the ship?
As I first came aboard the ship, well, it was interesting because I think that this was maybe one of the greatest crews that they'd ever put together. I think it was all hand-picked. And I think well over 95% of the commissioning crew was still aboard when I came aboard. So it was a going operation. And I caught the ship in Pearl Harbor with Admiral Halsey. We had slightly different quarters, but we both got aboard and we hit the road for Westpac, and that was where I started.
In Western Pacific, Westpac means?
Western Pacific.
What was your reaction when you first saw the ship? Because it was an Iowa-class ship, different than other battleships.
Yeah, I just thought it was the best-looking battleship I'd ever seen, and I still think so. I think that it looks more like a destroyer than it does a battleship, except that it's mighty big.
Once you're aboard the Battleship New Jersey, talk to us a little bit about the duties, your experiences, people you met, in any order that you'd like.
Well, as far as the people I met, I sure can't remember very any by name, but my experiences were that I became involved with the 5-inch battery, and we had been pretty well checked out at the Naval Academy on operating the computer that worked with the director's topside, and so I got into that division, and it was kind of interesting. Our division officer was a Naval Academy guy, but a reserve, because he flunked the physical when he graduated, and he'd been a civilian until early in the war, and it was a very, very excellent division, and I thought the level of the intelligence was just absolutely remarkable to me. I used to play these guys in cribbage, and I'd get chopped most of the time.
Talk to me a little bit about the operation of the Mark I computer.
Well, the Mark I had a gyro, and so that the people in the directors would line up your line of sight on the target, and then you would the radar would be pulling in the range, and you had a crank that changed the range rate that the computer was saying. So if it started to get too fast, then you'd slow it down by cranking backwards. And, worked really very simply, and when it got finished, when it didn't take more than about 10 seconds, you had pretty good gun orders for firing guns.
How long would it take from the time the radar sighted in, say, on an incoming aircraft, because the 5-inch guns were also used as anti-aircraft guns, until you could get the first shot out of the gun?
I would guess they'd probably get the first shot out in something less than 5 seconds. It might not be quite as well aimed as it would be after you had a little more time for a solution to gun solution on your computer. About 10 seconds, maybe.
And how many people operated this computer?
Well, we had 4 computers, 2 in the aft plot and 2 in the forward plot, one for each of the 4 Mark 37 directors, the 5-inch directors topside. And we had a normal hookup for which director each computer went with, and so when you went to general quarters or anything like that, that all happened automatically. I got pretty good at the switchboard in that plotting room, which was kind of interesting. I don't think too many people ever tried to figure out all those crazy switches.
Explain a little bit.
Well, they had switches so you could, any mount could get gun directions from any of the directors through any one of the 4 computers, so that you just had to set them up so that you knew which one you were controlling, and then that would be, and which guns you were controlling. The guns could be put on either, on any one of the 4 computers.
And talk to me a little bit about your experiences in that gun plot during actual combat situations. What is it like being there while you're being attacked by aircraft, or you're fired on sure targets, or being fired on by another ship?
Well, you just, in essence, were told what to do, because the air defense officer was up in the 07 level on the tower, and he ran the air defense operation, and he would tell what planes to take under attack and which ones to not worry about because they weren't in our range or going away or something.
And he visually sighted these planes?
He could visually sight them. He also had a screen, a radar screen up there, so he could get a pretty good handle on of whether he had a good target and one that they could probably shoot at.
And what would be some of the typical conversation that might take place between the air officer and people in the gun plot room? What would go on?
Well, I guess I don't remember too much. Just that they would tell, they would call the directors were 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the computers were 1, 2, 3, and 4, but they weren't necessarily assigned to the same directors, but it didn't make any difference. And so then after you were hooked up to one of your directors, the boys in the director officer would be the guy that was ordinarily telling you, we've got a target, start tracking, and if you started shooting and they were missing, he would tell you which direction to crank in a spot.
Did you ever have much communications with the 5-inch turrets? Did you talk with the men during or after the combat situation?
The only time that they really had a lot of interplay with the turrets was when they aligned the system, and that was a kind of an interesting operation. And they just do it when we were in combat. They would do it by lining up on the horizon, and then they would have to go through and line each mount with a baseline, and then they had to tie each of the computers to that same baseline, and then they would get them all lined up together, and it was utterly amazing. My roommate, when I eventually got a room, was really the 5-inch expert, and he knew how that computer worked inside and out, and he ran an awful good ship. That we used to knock down sleeves on about 3 rounds, or we figured we'd fail the course.
What was this person's name? Do you recall?
Red Hebert. I can't remember what his first name was, but I know he was redheaded, and he was from Arkansas, and I have totally lost track of him. Although I did look him up once long after we were on the New Jersey, and had a good chat with him. Was trying to get one of the Navy labs to use him on one of the modifications to these ships they were trying to do at that point, and I thought they needed some help and he could do it. I don't think it ever worked. I don't think he ever got involved.
Do you recall your feelings, your reactions during combat situations in that room, in that compartment you came back?
Well, combat, everything was course, preset then and operating. So the only changes would be they might change a couple of the gun mounts from one director to another director, and that would be the air defense officer up there in the 7th level, and he'd just say, put gun mount 2 to director 3, and that would be all that he'd have to say, and it would happen.
How long would these periods of general quarters last? Would it be an hour, 2, 3 hours?
Well,
every day?
When we were in the combat and under attack and stuff like that, we could have general quarters that would last for over 12 hours. In fact, that's why it got to be a little bit difficult when you blew the whistle accidentally, which I did one day. And that is not anything that's very welcome, because most of the guys hadn't been to bed in 12 to 15 hours, and some of them were back on watch, so they weren't even going to bed at that point.
Tell me, you mentioned that you set off a false alarm one day?
Yeah, I did. And right in the middle of the combat zone, and not too long after we'd spent all night at GQ. What we had was our ship spaces that we were taking care of included secondary aft, which is the area around the number 4 Mark 37 director aft. And one of the things they have there is a contact maker for the general alarm. Natural place to have one. And I went up there one day because our boys have told me that the general alarm contact maker was frozen. It was rusted. And so I went down in main comm and turned off the general alarm switch, I thought, and went up there with the boys, and we got it loose in about an hour or so. And after we had her operating and thought it was working fine, I shoved it over just to check, be sure that it was free and no longer was subject to being restricted by rust. And the first thing I knew was the general alarm went off, and we knew exactly where it was triggered from right where I had it. And the secondary battery watchstander that was up there on duty, he called the bridge and told them what had happened, and that we were sorry, and canceled the general quarters. It was a mistake. I had to go up to the bridge and make my peace, and then went down to main comm to find out what happened, who turned that switch back on. And it was typical of a simple mistake. It was a case of I turned off the gas alarm and not the general alarm, because the titles were on top and or bottom, and I looked at the wrong one. And the way I had turned that switch off was exactly the way I'd left it. It had nothing to do with my problem, because it wasn't the right switch.
Did you get in any trouble for that?
No, I settled down pretty fast.
Now, while you were aboard ship, Captain Holden was still in charge of the ship?
Yes, he was.
Can you tell me something about Captain Holden? Any reactions, remembrances of the person?
I thought he was a very good skipper. He was not a sound off, and he maintained a very good, I think, atmosphere on the bridge, where when he talked, people listened, but he wasn't talking all the time. I really didn't get to know him very well, because I stood no watches on the bridge when I was on the New Jersey. That was one of the things I kind of regretted, but that's the way it was. My watch station was down there on the computer with getting ready to fire the 5-inch guns if necessary.
You also said that you served aboard while Admiral Halsey was on the ship.
Yes.
Fleet Admiral. Can you tell us anything about Admiral Halsey?
Well, he was a character. I think a very, very good officer, and I think we always felt pretty comfortable when Halsey was running the show. He was a goer. And it just was interesting that I got aboard the ship in Pearl Harbor because they were coming back to Pearl Harbor to change.
Bob Walters, contact quarterdeck 7203. Bob Walters, contact the quarterdeck 7203.
Because what was I telling you? He was he was a very effective officer, and I think we all were pretty comfortable when he was there. What I was going to say is I got made contact or got on the ship initially because the ship was in Pearl Harbor to pick up old Admiral Halsey, because Admiral Spruance had just finished his tour and they were changing the boss. They changed the whole crew of the whole staff of that officer, and one would be in Pearl Harbor making up their plans for the next operation, while the other one would be aboard ship and running the show.
How did the crew react to Halsey and Spruance, two different people, two different fleet admirals?
I don't think from my level that I could tell any difference at all. They were both very, very competent people, and I think that we couldn't tell the difference as to who was running the show.
What was the morale of the crew? Some people have been aboard the ship for several years, the plank owners, so to speak.
Yeah.
What was the morale of the crew when you came aboard in 44 to 45?
I thought it was spectacular. There were no weak links in it that I ever found, and that's why I say I think the whole crew of that ship probably was hand-picked initially, and about 95% of that commissioning crew was still aboard when I got aboard in August of 44.
How did the crew feel about going into combat against the enemy, either enemy aircraft or land targets or ships?
I think we all figured that we were on about as good a base as we could be on to go into war with anybody, and that was about the way they felt. We were hit only once when I was aboard, and that was about the first or second time that we were into
Bob Walters to the quarterdeck. Bob Walters to the quarterdeck.
when we were what was I talking about?
Talking about the first time you were hit.
Oh, yeah. We were in Ulithi, which was our operating base in Westpac all during the Philippines, and we were well, I can't remember what I was going to say.
About the time you were hit?
Oh, yeah, we were in Ulithi, anchored, and the whole fleet was in there, which was a monstrous lagoon, and one of these, all these little islands that formed a perfect harbor. But we were in there, and in those days, this was my first bunk room. Was up.
Lieutenant Mullen, call it quarterdeck. Lieutenant Mullen, quarterdeck.
On the port side, we used to have it was on the O2 level, we had a junior officer's bunk room, and we had about 8 ensigns in there, I think, and we all had bunks, maybe 9, something like that. And I had a top bunk that was a thwart ship with a porthole right next to it, and I was looking out that porthole one morning, and there were still ships coming in. Part of the fleet was still arriving.
This is the test and that's 1MC, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Test complete.
They were still firing, and when we come in, that was the time that they fired right outside the harbor. But
Was it test firing or firing?
No, it was firing. Test firing. It was practice firing. They'd pull a sleeve and they'd shoot at it. But they were supposed to have danger bearings that they'd stop before they got into anything like hitting anything inside the Ulithi harbor. And I was sitting there watching out through this porthole, and I saw a splash out there, and then I saw another splash, and then another splash, and they were coming right across the harbor, right at us. And pretty soon I heard they wanted the damage control party to report to the second deck aft under the fantail, and one of those 5-inch shells had gone right through the aft, and it landed next to a guy that was asleep in his bunk. Did not explode, didn't cause any big damage, and the damage control guys got it out of there and over the side, and no problem. But it was
interviewed,
interesting.
by the way, the ship's corpsman who took care of that man.
Is that right?
Almost lost his leg. They were able to sew it back. The shell didn't explode, severed his leg.
Okay,
They were able to,
I did not know that. I didn't know it would hit him at all. I thought it was between his bunk and the bulkhead, but apparently not.
The corpsman's name was Donald Barrier.
Okay.
And the man later, several months later, sent a picture back. He was okay in the hospital.
Yep.
And he recovered. I guess he was going to have a limp or so, but he had
Yeah,
his legs.
okay, that's great. I really never knew what happened to that situation,
What
but
was the reaction? Do you recall the reaction of the ship's company to that?
well, I'm sure that the CO of the destroyer that was firing got read out the riot act. It didn't have any effect on our ship. Most of them didn't even know we were hit. Just that damage control group that had to go in and pull the thing out, and the guy that got hit were the only ones that even knew it, really.
Was that unusual? Was that a dummy shell, or was it?
No, it was a live shell, but it did not explode.
So you're very lucky then.
And we were very lucky, but it was one of the things that they always did. But somebody missed on cutting off firing when they passed their danger bearing, and they were just dropping these shells right across the harbor.
One thing I'm asking the people about that interview was, what was the crew like on the ship? You said they were very outstanding people. Did you get to know any of the enlisted crewmen?
Oh yes, you see, in that situation where I was, our watches were also in that same plotting room. The only difference is that we'd have only about a third of the people, and we weren't prepared to shoot a lot of rounds or change everything around very fast. But the enlisted men that were in that plotting room, we knew like brothers because we spent a lot of time together. And of course, we had some jokesters, and they would pull some funny ones. They had some kid who was, I'm not sure whether, I don't think he'd ever finished high school, and he was a little vulnerable. And they used to hook up a loudspeaker to the sound-powered phone, and then they'd start talking to him, and he wouldn't have the slightest idea who was talking to him, but they knew everything he did, and it puzzled him quite a bit.
Do you recall any of the operations that you're involved in, such as the Philippines,
Yeah.
etc., and so on? Can you describe any of those operations? What took place? Your remembrances of them?
I think the main thing, other than the fact that we were there, and was the time that the Japs came through the San Bernardino Straits behind the Lady Landings. And we were all up chasing a couple of theoretical Japanese carriers, and I think there were carriers up there, but I don't think we ever found them. But what I do remember is that these Japs came through early in the morning, and we got urgent call to get those battleships down here. We got Japanese ships behind the landing on Lady Gulf, and it was interesting. We were held up by the Iowa. It was just two of us, the Iowa and the New Jersey, and about the most that the Iowa had a bad shaft, or I think it was a bad propeller that they'd run aground or something. And so we couldn't do more than about 27 knots. And when we got back to San Bernardino Straits, the Japs had already gone back through with, I think, one exception. I think they put some rounds into one cruiser that was kind of the tail end boat on the Jap fleet. But we didn't catch them, but we scared them off.
Now, Halsey was a fleet commander at this point.
He was the fifth fleet, third fleet.
Third fleet. Did anybody, quote, blame him for the situation, that he pulled his ships away from the main task force? Or what was do you recall the reaction of the crew to this?
Well, I'm not sure that the crew knew much about it or were much worried, but I remember one of the funny stories that came out is that they were sending a message to Halsey from Pearl Harbor. And the message, they always had, you know, extra words that they put in at the beginning and the ending, because that was part of breaking up the rhythm of regular language, and it made it tougher to break as a code. And the message that I remember was that started off, all the world is wondering where Mr. Halsey and the Fifth Fleet is, and that was the end of the message from Nimitz. And that was because we were there and there were ships coming through San Bernardino Strait that we had those people under attack the day before, and one of the ships that was sunk the day before was the other one of the Yamato class. There were two of those Yamato class. The last one went down on its own very late in the war, but the other one was sunk there in the middle of the Philippines while we were still where we should have been.
The Battleship New Jersey was built to fight other battleships. It never fought other battleships. Did the crew react to this in any way that you recall?
I don't think particularly so. They all understood what the situation was, that naval war had turned into a carrier operation and not battleships. But the battleships were pretty effective, as they were talking about this morning, in bombarding the shore and helping the infantry especially when they were making landings, because the trouble with landings is that the infantry has very little of the heavy artillery that they ordinarily would have in a battle ashore. And that's where these big ships with those 14-inch or 16-inch rifles could really do a job. So I don't think the crew ever was much concerned about the fact that they weren't using the heavy operations, heavy machinery very much.
During combat, and especially when the fleet was attacked by Japanese aircraft, what was the feeling to be in a situation like that? What was your reaction, your feelings to that?
Well, we all had the feeling that the best way that we were going to be protected was by the aircraft we already had in the air, and but when they got close enough, we would start firing at them, and that was what we were there for. Sometimes they got a little close, but we never had one hit us. I think one hit the top of one of the turrets on the Missouri one time, but we never were hit by any heavy bombs.
New Jersey was considered a lucky ship at that time?
I think it was considered a lucky ship, yeah. We all thought it was a lucky ship because it just never got hit. But none of the big battle wagons particularly got hit. They were all they were low priority targets. The things the Japs were after always were the carriers.
One question I started asking recently, is about the crew. The crew today on a ship, Marines, Navy, Air Force, whatever, it's a really mixed group of people. But then the crew is largely a white crew, and the blacks and Filipinos were the stewards. So I'm trying to research their condition, their situations, and so on like that. Do you recall any situations? Did you work with any of the stewards, talk to any of the stewards at all? And how did they interact and fit in with the ship?
Well, as far as I remember, we had no problems. And that's because the stewards they knew that was the place they were going to go when they came into the Navy. I don't think it was right either, but that's the way it was. And we didn't have any demonstrations or any problems with getting along with each other, and they did an excellent job in the officers' mess. I could never complain about that at all. We had good food and well prepared. Was there much interaction between the minorities and the white crew members? Like any boxing matches, sporting events, or no? Yeah, a little bit, but we didn't get ashore. 12 o'clock.
We did relieve the watch on deck, section 1.
We didn't get ashore often enough to do much of that when I was aboard. We were always at sea. The only time we were not was when I came in with the Jersey to Bremerton Navy Yard, and we were on our way back out when the war ended. And that's how I got to Eniwetok.
You mentioned that Ulithi was the fleet's base.
Yep.
You went ashore at Ulithi. What was Ulithi like?
It was just a bunch of little islands, and they were all very sharp because they were all coral. And they had sand and stuff. We used to play baseball games.
Brian Lang to the quarterdeck. Brian Lang to the quarterdeck.
But and we'd go swimming. But you had to be mighty careful because there were some pretty sharp cornered rocks down there under that water. But and we always took beer ashore and had beers for all the people, and it was always much too warm because it came out of a hole somewhere. They put a little ice in it when they sent it over to Ulithi, but it didn't get very cold before it was drunk.
Now, is there anything I should have asked you about your World War II experiences that I didn't you think is important to talk about?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
After the war, you were with the ship until August 1945.
Right.
And after that, what did you do next?
Went to flight training.
Flight training, okay.
Yeah. That was my reason for getting in the Navy, and I never changed. And I was lucky that I ended up going to Corsairs and during flight training, and then went to a Corsair squadron, and that was my first love as an airplane, where way back in high school or before.
Why did you like the Corsairs?
Just thought it was a great looking airplane. I still think it's the prettiest airplane that they've ever flown.
And how
In
long?
fact, I got one right here. That's a Corsair.
Why don't you hold that up right in front of you? Oh, excellent.
And the thing about the Corsair is it has bent wings. And the reason for that was kind of interesting. When the Corsair was being designed, which was just before World War II, 38, 39, they had a new engine, Pratt & Whitney engine, which we had in our Corsairs. But the trouble with the Pratt & Whitney engine was that it had put too much power. And in those days, they didn't know much about propeller blades or changing them around. And so there was, I think it was 14 feet diameter is what they needed with a propeller to absorb the power of that engine. Well, the only trouble is that if you put a 14-foot prop on a straight wing airplane, you were going to have landing struts that were about 5 or 6 feet long, very unwieldy and difficult to fold into the wing because it takes such a big space. So they came up with this bright idea: is if we bend the wings, then we can put the wheels out here where the wings are the closest to the ground and make a normal wheel there for a carrier landing, and it worked fine.
And why did you like the Corsair? How did it handle? I should ask.
It was a spectacular airplane in those days. I think it was, in my opinion, that and the P-51, and I'll never know which one was better, were the two greatest fighters that flew in World War II. And I loved the Corsair because I was a Navy type.
And did you stay in the Navy as a career, or what happened?
I theoretically was in it for a career, but after about 11 years, I decided it looked like it was nothing else was going to happen for a while, and so I got out and worked for eventually for General Electric. I started out, spent 2 years with Honeywell, and then got transferred, or I went to work for General Electric of my own accord. And ended up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where I spent about almost 30 years.
How does your experiences aboard the battleship, how do they impact your later life?
Well, I guess that I would say that not anything very specific, except for one thing. When we came back to Bremerton, to the Navy Yard, I was in the second leave group. And that didn't seem like a very good plan to me, so I called up my girlfriend and I said, why don't you come out here and we'll get married? And that's exactly where we got married. And the individual that walked her down the aisle was Commander R.H. Rice, who was the executive officer. The CO, and I forget his name at that point, Holden had left. And but the CO had some physical problem, and he was over at the hospital in Seattle. So Captain or Commander R.H. Rice was the guy that walked her down the aisle. And I guess the thing that I have always felt worst about is it turned out that R.H. Rice came from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And that's where I eventually went to work for General Electric and spent, boy, about over 25 years. And I was going in there one day to the junior college. My oldest son was there, and I don't remember what his problems were, but I was going to see the student counselor. And in the other corner of that room where I was sitting there for about 25 minutes waiting was a Rear Admiral R.H. Rice, who was a native of Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And I just absolutely goofed and didn't remember that that was the same guy that as a commander had walked my wife down the aisle to get married. So that was when I dropped the ball. And I never did get to see him again, and eventually I didn't even know he was on the New Jersey, this guy that lived in Pittsfield, until he died. And in his obit they had his whole Navy career, and right there it was, XO of the New Jersey. I said, boy, you goofed on that one.
Is there, to wrap up the interview now, sir, is there anything that else that you want to add, say, or whatever? I just leave this open for people as an open statement at this point.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that my worst experience was that accidental general quarters in the middle of a combat zone, but that didn't amount to too much. It got settled rather quickly. I went down there ready to kill somebody and found out that I was the one that should be killed.